All right, I'm on. Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I can't tell you what joy this gathering is bringing to me. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Gail Slater. I'm Assistant Attorney General here at the Department of Justice for Antitrust. And you're all very, very welcome here. A few thank yous. First off, some of my wonderful deputies are going to moderate panels here in a bit. The inimitable Omid Asafi, who is going to talk to several of our most important MAGA influencers and voices online in what we call the independent media. And if that wasn't enough, Amid's decided he's going to get married this weekend. So he's going to have a big week this week. Let's put it that way. And then Roger Alford, who's my principal deputy, is here. He's going to talk to some very thoughtful lawyers about how we as an administration can take action on the very important issue of free speech, conservative speech in particular. And Roger's the right man for the job because he is a law professor from the University of Notre Dame, so perfect person to bring lots of big brains together. We're going to kick off with two of my good friends from the administration here. To my right, Chairman Ferguson of the Federal Trade Commission. He's known to a lot of you already. This guy to my left needs absolutely no introduction, I fear. Brendan Carr. They are both what I would call free market warriors, but they're also, even more importantly, free speech warriors. And I can't thank them enough for their friendship and for their collegiality on these issues. Before we get started, I'm gonna leave you with what I would call one big picture thought that I have, which is the late great Andrew Breitbart used to talk about how our politics are downstream from our culture. And in the past decade or so, we've realized that our culture is usually downstream of technology, and that really, really matters when it comes to this issue. And so with that, I'm gonna turn to these gentlemen because they are men of action. They are solution-oriented. They're going to tell us from each agency's standpoint. I'll start with you, Chairman Carr, if I may. How do you think about this really, really important, critical issue of our time? And what is the FCC doing since, in your case, and also in Chairman Ferguson's case, January 20th, because we were very, very fortunate to have you both hit the ground running that day. So what is the FCC doing, putting into action already with regards to free speech?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Gail. Thank you so much to everyone that's here. It's wonderful to see so many old friends in this building, and I can only stop and think, if you go back a couple months ago, last fall, if there had been an alternate timeline in which direction this country have gone, I definitely don't think this group would be gathered in this building today. Maybe some of you would be gathered here on different floors of this building, but this is a much, much nicer and more interesting, I guess, as Elon likes to say, the most interesting timeline is likely the one that we're going to end up on, and this is just fantastic to see so many of you here. I mean, look, the
Amen.
reason that... Yeah.
Amen. Thank you.
And thanks again, obviously, to Gail and her team for organizing this. President Trump has been ahead of the curve on so many issues. If you just look from the border to relationships with China, but one of the most important things that he hit on very, very early on was free speech. He saw before so many other people the amount of censorship that was coming, particularly out of Silicon Valley. When you look back at the sweep of history, there has never been a point in time when there has been so few entities that have so much control over the free flow of information. And it's at an interesting time. We came out of this era when if you were regulated by the FCC, if you had a license to be a broadcaster, you were effectively the gatekeeper. And people had very, very little options for news and information. Basically, in the morning, when the newspaper clunked on your doorstep, or at night when you sort of yelled at your kids to adjust the rabbit ears, those were the only means you had for information. And that choke point control was fundamentally destroyed by the internet, particularly in its early days. People were blogging, people were posting, people were getting access to a wide variety of news and information. All of a sudden, we started to see control at the internet layer. And again, it started with Silicon Valley, and you had their worldview that was being impressed on everybody across the country. And I think one of the things that Gail said in her confirmation is, it's not just tyranny.gov we have to worry about, but it's tyranny.com. And we've just been living through this unprecedented surge in censorship. It accelerated during COVID-19, right? Whenever you have increase in government control, you necessarily have decrease in free speech, because free speech is the check on government control. And we just saw that accelerate unbelievably. Silicon Valley, Facebook, Google's, a lot of the times they did this on their own. They chose to censor people. Other times we had the Biden administration officials that were literally pressuring social media companies to censor. We had Mark Zuckerberg issue what I describe as his mea culpa letter last year, where he said that he was pressured and he's newly found an embrace of free speech. I think it's great. I welcome it. I hope that it's durable. I hope that it doesn't shift as quickly as it shifted against us, and we'll see how that plays out. X obviously has always stood there, always been in the breach, at least under Elon Musk's leadership. And I think Google is one that still has a lot of work to do to come back to the fold in terms of embracing free speech. I think there's a really important role for the FCC. Back in 2020, when President Trump first called for Section 230 reform, I was out very early supporting that effort. And Section 230, it's commonly referred to as Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, but I like to remind people it's actually Section 230 of the Communications Act, which the FCC administers. And back then, one of the Trump administration officials that did a lot of work on this Section 230 issue, Adam Kandub, when he worked at the Commerce Department, has agreed to come back into government service. He's my general counsel, and he's the point person for me on helping to smash the censorship cartel. One of the things that we have to do with the FCC, we have to engage in 230 reform. And the way we do it is pretty simple. If you're going to leave someone else's speech up, if you're not going to engage in censorship, that's great. There's a path forward for you to continue to have 230 protections. But if you're going to censor, outside of whatever the right you have to do under the First Amendment, if you're going to try to censor with these bonus Section 230 protections, I think that's where the FCC can step in and clarify and say 230 does not grant you the sweep of immunities that courts have incorrectly read into 230. And this is something that Justice Thomas has spoken very clearly about. So I think there's a role for the FCC there. I also think there's a role for the FCC on transparency. We have authority in the Communications Act to require much more transparency about how these decisions are being made. Right now, it's been a black box, why you get demonetized, why you get blocked. So I think we can step in there. Also, we're looking globally. You know, it's not just an issue with domestic censorship. We're seeing a real surge globally in this sort of counter to free speech. Brazil has a lot of problems right now. They have this Justice de Morais who's effectively tried to shut down social media in Brazil. He issued a decision that effectively censors X, and what he said in his decision was he was trying to censor social media to prevent what he described as anti-democratic acts. And if you go through the decision, he defines what anti-democratic acts are. He said it's people, taking a little bit of liberty, but this is effectively what he said, people going into the voting booth with information in their brain that has not been provided by the political party that's in power. And he cited to Brexit and President Trump's win in 2016 as the type of populist outcomes that he was worried that free speech would enable. Again, other people that have gotten more into the weeds of this than me have explained this, but there was a period of time in like 2012 when our government, our State Department, looked across the globe and tried to support free speech because they believed that free speech would accelerate the downfall of regimes that they didn't like. And then flash forward, when there was regimes in that they liked, all of a sudden they tried to censor populist movements to protect those in power. So the very same efforts going on in the State Department and other places that were pro-free speech at some point have been flipped on their head and are being used to censor. And that's why so many of the reforms that are taking place right now, shutting down a lot of these groups that were really just fronts for imposing this global censorship regime, is so important. So I think there's a lot we can do. There's a lot we can do. Frankly, it's a cultural matter to restore free speech. And it actually wasn't that long ago that at least some on the progressive left embraced free speech. The modern day op-ed actually launched on the pages of the New York Times in 1970. This was not a group where I thought I'd come and praise the New York Times, but it's actually true. There was an editor back then, a guy named John Oakes. And the reason he launched the op-ed page at the New York Times, he said, was because, in his words, diversity of opinion is the lifeblood of democracy. The moment we insist that everyone think the same way we do, our democratic way of life is in jeopardy. A New York Times progressive. Flash forward 50 years, and you see the New York Times, censoring op-eds from sitting members of Congress that don't fit with the orthodoxy that they're on. So the FCC is working hard on this. We're looking globally at the censorship regimes, whether it's Brazil. I was just in Europe pushing back on the DSA, which is effectively a censorship regime where they're trying to get U.S. technology companies to censor speech. We're going to push the envelope on Section 230 reform. And then finally, a lot of the censorship, in my view, is downstream of DEI. It's downstream of identity politics. And so we're also working at the FCC to address that. We've got investigations going on DEI practices at Disney, ABC, at Comcast. And more generally, we're trying to hold the media companies we do regulate at the FCC to their public interest obligation. We have investigations right now on NBC, CBS, ABC, PBS, NPR, and maybe missing a few, but I'd say it's a pretty good start. And we're going to keep sort of working until we get all the results we want, until we fully smash the censorship cartel and make sure it can't be reconstituted again.
That was awesome. Thank you. Brother Carr. I so appreciate everything you've done. I mean, since 2018, when you started serving as commissioner, and then through today, and boy, have you hit the ground running. And we're going to hear a little bit later from your general counsel, Adam Kandub, who's going to drill down into what else the FCC has cooking. So with that, to the other free speech warrior to my right, obviously, Chairman Ferguson, we're not going to ask you about pending litigation, anything like that, but you've got a few things going on, and you have a few things going on beyond pending litigation. So if you can just bring us up to speed, because you also hit the ground running January 20th, of which we're very, very grateful. What's going on at the FTC with regards to speech and whatever else is on your mind.
Well, thanks for having me. This is like the coolest audience I've ever spoken in front of, so I'm really happy to be here. I've been driving past the Justice Department to come to work since 2024. And in 2024, every time I drive past here, it felt like driving past Barad-dûr, like the Black Tower in Mordor. You can almost see the eye at the top. And then January 20th, it's like it's smashed, and it's totally different. And now it's fun driving past. It was like scary going past before.
Can I say amen again?
Yeah. All right, I got my Tolkien reference. That's the only one. So Justice Thomas was invoked a minute ago, and I'm going to use that to explain how I think about free speech and what the commission is doing about it. So Justice Jackson, one of the most gifted writers the court has ever had, very famously said, if there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, may prescribe what is orthodox in politics or religion. And that is what the First Amendment means. And that, for a young Justice Thomas fan who then went on to clerk for him, is sort of like the thing you keep in the front of your mind, is the thing that makes America different than the rest of the sometimes benighted world, is that everyone here may speak his or her mind whenever they want. And that is what unlocks the search for truth. Good speech defeats bad speech. That has been the thrust of American history for a very long time. Okay, so we get to the censorship crisis that begins before 2020, but everyone becomes very aware of in 2020. And a lot of what I hear from my friends, conservative friends, are, well, hey, look, free speech is whatever the First Amendment says, and the First Amendment is concerned about what the government does. And so if private people want to censor, that's not really what free speech is about. And I remember saying, but if it ends up with all of us in the same place that we would be in if there were government censors, which is a handful of elites with it who has, as it turns out, truly horrifying and terrifying views, get to decide who speaks and about what. What's the difference? And the answer was something about like we need to care as much about like the free speech rights of gargantuan corporations as individuals. And my response was, okay, maybe, I don't think so, but maybe, but there are things that they are doing when they censor that might break other laws irrespective of the content of their speech. Why don't we try that? And then I think some stuff that's happened in First Amendment law has made what Brendan was just talking about the FCC doing, and what I'm about to talk about the FTC even more important. I'm talking about net choice. So we have this problem, which is these gargantuan platforms act as gatekeepers for speech. We're deciding who got to speak on what topics, and if you breached the rules being set by, the truly terrifying Silicon Valley elites, you just weren't allowed to speak, and you were thrown off. And you could lose your living, because if you're making your living online, they just cut you off. Sometimes they wouldn't censor you. They would just make sure no one saw your post, which is the same thing, but they could plausibly say, oh, we didn't take your post down. And so Texas and Florida, acting in the interest of the commons to promote the flourishing of their citizens, tried to take this on sort of directly by saying, if you are this type of platform, we're not telling you what you must say, but we are telling you you're not allowed to take people's posts down. You enjoy this position of prominence, you have all this market power, you can't take it down. And the Supreme Court, admittedly, reasonable minds can disagree about what exactly they're saying, basically said, no, we're not comfortable with these sorts of laws, these sort of like direct regulatory efforts at the platforms and their speech decisions. And I think that makes the Communications Act and the Federal Trade Commission Act super important because they aren't speech laws directly. They're not about us deciding who gets to say what, when, or where, but they are, at least in the FTC's case, aimed at regulating the power that might allow the platforms to decide who gets to speak. And Brendan was right. President Trump was way ahead of the curve on this. He issued an EO in 2020 that directed the FTC to consider undertaking investigations about whether deplatforming and censorship decisions were violating the FTC Act. And the clearest potential example of this is if you are a platform and you have terms of service that talk about being a free speech platform, or you have terms of service that have community standards that say, here are the topics you're not allowed to talk about, here's the process by which the removal happens, here are potential appeal rights. And then you do stuff contrary to that, that's exactly what the FTC Act generally forbids. It forbids a business from telling consumers one thing and doing something else. And one of the first things we did at the FTC is what President Trump asked the FTC to do in 2020, which was we opened up a request for information to the public and said, if you have been censored in violation of terms of service, tell us. Give us the examples. If you have documentation, screenshots, whatever, you should tell us. And we're leaving that comment period open for some time. They're on their way in now. I think the other thing that really concerns me as an antitrust enforcer about the wielding of market power to potentially affect speech outcomes actually has to do with advertisers. So the way that platforms and a lot of speakers online make their living is through what they say, but not because people fork over their money to listen to them talk. It's because people want to listen to them talk, and advertisers know that and want to advertise next to what they're saying. And if the eyeballs are being drawn by the speaker, the advertisers get to take advantage of that as well. Here's the problem, though. If a bunch of advertisers are going to get into a room and they're going to say, can we all agree amongst ourselves that if a person talks about these topics, we're not going to put our advertisements next to them? Or if they get into a room and say, let's all agree that this third party is going to set the rules about when we're going to advertise based on the content of speech, and if they're talking about certain topics, we're not going to put our advertisements on there, you are drying up the advertisements to the people who are speaking, and therefore drying up access to the ideas. It's not just about the bottom line of the speaker, although that is important, but if they can't make a living presenting their ideas, the ideas themselves can't get presented. And I've written about this in a concurrence when I was a minority commissioner, but that is a classic antitrust violation. It's just a concerted refusal to deal, and so that's one of the things that we at the FTC are taking very seriously. We're a law enforcement agency. There are a lot of limitations on the types of things I can say about what the FTC is doing. But suffice to say, like I said in 2024, this is super important to me, both because it is potentially just a naked violation of the core principle of the antitrust laws, which prohibits people getting in a room and agreeing not to make deals with somebody else. But I think the most dangerous exercise of market power that we confront in America today is market power that dries up either ideas or access to those ideas. And I often hear the criticism that what I'm describing is not a, quote, traditional concern of antitrust, end quote. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Of course it is. If you wield market power to injure consumers, that is a traditional concern of antitrust. And antitrust is not just limited to price and output. And I think drying up access to ideas is an injury to consumers that the antitrust laws care about. And if the wielding of market power unlawfully makes that possible, that is what the FTC Act is for.
So that's another amen from me. Thank you. So listen, we've heard both these chairmen have hit the ground running, and we're very, very grateful for them both. We have a thing or three going on at the DOJ too, but we're not here to talk about my business. I'm inspired by them both. As the great Stephen K. Bannon would say to his audience, it's time for action, action, action. And with that, I'm going to ask Omid to come up and introduce his panel, and we'll take it from there. But thanks again to everybody for being here. This is a great audience.
Thank you, Gail.
Hey everyone, my name's Omid. I was the acting head of antitrust for, depending on whether you like me or not, 2 or 3 months. But that's a tough act to follow. I don't think Brendan and Andrew are sufficiently fired up for this audience, so hopefully we bring some more spice. While we're waiting for the mic to work, we're going to have one more chair brought for this very, very illustrious panel that we have. I don't think we could have found a panel of more people who could be accurately described as the biggest loyalist to President Trump and his agenda. But I'll have them all come up now, beginning with Mike Davis, the head of the Article 3 project. If you want to come up, Mike, maybe get the. I'd hate to say please clap, but I think that's what I need to say. If we could have Steve Bannon please come up, the founder and head of the War Room. New York Post columnist and Fox News contributor Miranda Devine. And January 6th advocate, tennis aficionado and sous chef Julie Kelly. And then Benny Johnson, who really needs no introduction, but he's the host of the YouTube channel Benny Johnson. Benny, please, over here. As I tell the CEOs who meet with me, it's not going to hurt. You can sit down next to me. So I'd like to first just note that this panel, I mean, there are a lot of people who can be accurately described as the biggest loyalists and defenders of the president. I would just note that the people on the stage were as vociferous a defender of President Trump right after moments like the Mar-a-Lago raid as they are now. So I would just make the note that it's very easy to be a defender of President Trump now and a supporter of his now. But I remember when I worked on the Mueller probe, it wasn't a very attractive time to work for the president. And so it's an honor for me to host this panel and people who defend him no matter what's going on. So with that, I'd like to get started. But before we do get started, and this panel will be specifically about big tech censorship, I would like to ask Steve Bannon, how does it feel to be at DOJ?
Without handcuffs. I do want to see my Danbury file before I leave. I know they read all my emails.
So we're gonna kind of shift through the subject matters of traditional antitrust issues and some of the social media censorship between these panelists. I'd like to first talk to ask Steve and then Mike to kind of discuss the economic populist agenda, why and how that's a driver of the president's movement and agenda, and sort of what is antitrust, the role that antitrust enforcement plays in that movement.
Well, I think you see yesterday, President Trump's changing the entire world economic order around the working men and women in the middle class of the United States. I think it's just stunning what he's tried to accomplish and what he's going to accomplish. It's all about that. And I think if you look at the people he selected, the great 2 commissioners that were just here, right? And you look at Gail, you look at the people that he's put in the Justice Department, Antitrust, Omid, yourself, all of it, it's to me stunning. It is the first time, and I think the best team ever to represent an economic populace and actually represent the American people against the structure of our society economically and culturally is so overpowering against the individual. People should remember in 2016, it was Cernovich and the Pepe, some of these people that Benny Johnson remembers them, that, right? That learned how to work the algorithm at Facebook.
Me More won.
Exactly. Yeah. That was a huge reason we won. And right afterwards, you remember they had a full meltdown in their corporate headquarters of how that happened. And that's when they really stepped up, and it was purely the entrepreneurial spirit of you guys and Cernovich and others that actually we had a platform, because remember, Fox didn't really cover Trump, et cetera. And so it shows you the entrepreneurial spirit. President Trump is putting the interest of the nation first, and he's putting the interest of the American people first. And man, we have got a fight ahead of us. But what I'm so proud about on the side of really getting very smart people in the system to take on the system, no one's ever done it better. And I think if you go back and look at other Republican administrations, you see what we mean by controlled opposition, that people just tapped along to go along. Now, with the Supreme Court, we have some of the, I refer to it as the Thomas Court, and you look at people that work for Justice Thomas and have, believe, and you look at Gorsuch, the Mike Davises. If you see the coaching tree that's out there, this is some of the biggest impact we're ever going to have in American history. But all I would tell you, folks, is we're going to have a fight every day. And don't look, a huge win in November, but you see what's coming, right? And the gathering storm, and particularly in the courts, in the court right here in D.C., we're at the top of the first inning of this. It's going to take us 2 decades to get through this.
And as I turn it over to Mike, I know, Mike, you don't do enough social media and enough. But
I don't do any interviews.
Right, exactly. You're not out there enough. But let me, before I turn it over to you, let me just ask. You had mentioned the differences you see with the current leadership under Attorney General Bondi and Deputy Attorney General Blanche. Can you kind of expound on that and describe why you think antitrust can really kind of go at these economic populism issues and kind of what you've seen as the shift in antitrust from the first administration to here?
Well, let's just talk about the party. I mean, I grew up in Iowa. I grew up working class in Iowa. I know Andrew Ferguson grew up working class in Virginia. Otto Heck grew up working class in Indiana. We grew up working class. That would, when I was growing up as a young Alex P. Keaton Republican, I was the only Republican at my Irish and Italian Catholic school, right? It was all Democrat. If you go back to Iowa now, all of these working class people are Trump supporters. Trump realigned the party, right? And that is huge. And so what we're seeing with the shift in antitrust is a shift in the Republican constituency. This is no longer the Chamber of Commerce party, right? We do not believe in concentrated power. We believe in using our century-old antitrust laws, which they are law enforcement. This is targeted law enforcement, and you use our antitrust laws to target the anti-competitive tumors on the free markets, because free markets require functioning markets. And when you have trillion-dollar big tech monopolists, for example, using their market power to crush competition, to shutter small businesses, to cancel conservatives and others with whom they disagree, we no longer have functioning markets. We no longer have free markets. Remember, these big tech platforms want regulations. They call for regulations. Antitrust is the opposite of regulation because you're targeting the tumors with law enforcement. So with regulations, they have the lawyers, they have the lobbyists, they have the PR people to navigate those regulations. And actually, they want those because they're entry barriers to startup competitors. And so what the Antitrust Division is doing under Gail Slater, my good friend, and Omid, my good friend, is critically, critically important. This is not the George W. Bush Justice Department. I worked in the George W. Bush Justice Department. Good people, but they don't know what century it is, right? And this is also not the Trump 45 Justice Department. At the end of the Trump 45 Justice Department, Macon's here, they started these antitrust lawsuits, and I'll give them credit for that. But there was a sea change in the politics that had to happen in order for that to happen. And what the Trump 47 Justice Department is going to do is finish the job of what President Trump started in the first term. And they are going to make sure that we enforce our antitrust laws, we end antitrust amnesty, and we protect the free markets.
Thank you, Mike. And we're no fans of amnesty, but let me turn it over to Benny and Miranda and Julie to just kind of get more of a sense of what was the kind of tipping point for you all when you first noticed that these big tech companies had trained their sites on conservative voices, and kind of what was the first realization for you that this was actively happening?
Okay, so I got a great one for you. So Steve talks about the Pepe meme wars. Raise your hand if you've shared a meme in this audience. If you raise your hand if you like memes, okay? If you laugh at them. The president shares a meme. Elon shares a meme. Elon became a meme. It's indistinguishable, actually, Who's
the vice
meme?
president
Yeah.
became a meme.
That's exactly.
He's every meme.
That's exactly. The JD Vance memes
Right.
are incredible. In the back here is my executive producer. His name's ALX. He was working at a butcher shop, and I noticed that he's good at Twitter. This was nearly a decade ago. So I brought him here to DC to see if he might want to work for me, to tweet for me, Charlie, the Turning Point crew. ALX took the job, and he became a professional tweeter. He was really good at it. He's a very young man. ALX, how old are you? 22. Okay, so he's a young 22-year-old. Just entrepreneur, just trying to get started. He has a skill. He has a skill set. He's using it. He's rising in the ranks. And then what happened? He shared the wrong meme. When we say meme wars, we mean it. These things scare them. They scare them so much that when ALX shared a Xi Jinping as Winnie the Pooh meme? Was that it? Xi Jinping supports Joe Biden as a meme template. He wakes up with his account that was in a rocket ship, hundreds of thousands of followers, good career going, completely legs cut out from underneath him. I thought I had friends at Twitter. There were Republicans who were hired by Twitter to help us out, okay? You know exactly who those people are, walking around with a gimp suit on, you know, on their hands and knees, with a leash on, ball gag in. You know those Republicans. Anyway, they couldn't help us. They literally told me to go F off. They said, sorry, your boy posted the wrong meme. And we had to take it. It's not just like taking away his account. You understand? It's a lifetime ban. His career's over. He's done. He can't speak anymore. They took his knees out because he shared the wrong meme about the Communist Party of China. So they killed this guy for China? I mean, it was totally evil. And it's like that's a small... He was brought back, actually. You want to see the happy end of the story. I won't end on a sad note. I'm a glass half full kind of guy. Brought back on the same night as Trump by Elon Musk. So a round of applause for the great ALX, who's now ubiquitous on the platform and has 1 million followers. So they tried to destroy this young man's career, and they've done this time and time again. I will just simply say this. That was my black pill moment where I realized that even the so-called Republicans, and they don't care. They don't care. It's just a tool to suppress us. It's a tool to silence speech they don't like, to destroy careers, and more importantly, to control. The memes got out of control, so they had to kill the memers. And they tried to put a memer in jail, actually. In this building, they prosecuted a memer for sharing the wrong meme. So they're threatened by the speech that goes outside of the boundaries of which they can control. And that's all that I'm asking for here today. The final thing I'll say is I'm not asking for special privileges. That's the problem. I'm simply asking for the ability to speak. Having a fair and open dialogue is actually how President Trump got back into the White House. President Trump crossing barriers and going to the Joe Rogan podcast, doing Andrew Schultz's podcast, going on Theo Vaughn's podcast, doing NFL podcasts. These are also non-political podcasts that are platformed on these big platforms that in a different regime, they would have been shutting down Joe Rogan, and we all watched him try during COVID. We all watched him change the face, you know, the color on his face, and try to put they tried to put Joe Rogan down. That was the grotesque obesity of the tyranny of these people. They tried to shut down Joe Rogan. So it really isn't partisan, actually. It's identitarian, it's totally evil, and it's antithetical to being an American.
I did not have on my bingo card that you'd be the most wild person on the stage with some of...
It's a competition.
Right,
you see.
exactly. So Miranda, as the person who can take the biggest round of applause, I think, for the Hunter Biden laptop story, I would, yes. If you could detail, I think, for everybody, just kind of what you experience with big tech companies working sometimes in tandem with law enforcement to make sure, and the federal government kind of writ large, to make sure that this story didn't come to light, and just what impact they had on President Trump and his reelection, and yeah.
So in October of 2020, just 3 weeks before the election, we got an absolute cracker of a story from Rudy Giuliani. He had been given the laptop from hell, which was a hard drive copy of Hunter Biden's laptop. And it wasn't notable or a great story because there were countless nude photos of Hunter, having sex, smoking crack, etc. The real news gold in there was the evidence that Joe Biden had been involved in his son's influence peddling operation around the world when Joe was vice president. And there was good evidence on there. So that was what we did on October 14, 2020. We ran the first of our stories. It was an email showing that Joe Biden had met with one of Hunter Biden's business partners from Ukraine in DC when he was vice president. So we held that story from going online. Instead of putting it out the night before, it went online at 5 a.m. because we thought this is such a great story. We don't want other media to steal it from us. Little did we know. Within a few hours, Facebook and Twitter had shut the story down. Facebook suppressed it, but I mean that meant that I think 80% of the reach was gone. They throttled it. Twitter locked the New York Post account for 2 weeks, accused us of breaking their hacked materials policy. There was nothing hacked about what we had published. And they also basically made the rest of the media not trust us and not go with the story. And that was pure censorship. Now, at the time, we just thought, oh, this is just Twitter and Facebook being woke, being anti-Trump, which everybody knew they were. But what we hadn't realised at that stage and found out really only after the election was, and partly through the Twitter files, which Elon Musk, bought Twitter and opened up the files so that we could see exactly what happened that day, October 14, 2020. And what we found was that Twitter and also Facebook, we found out later, were crawling with FBI operatives, so-called retired agents. There were so many of them that they had their own Slack channel and they used to kind of onboard newcomers. And they were, the most serious of those people was a man called James Baker. And he'd been the general counsel for the FBI. And lo and behold, 6 months before the 2020 election, he gets parachuted into Twitter as the deputy counsel, deputy top lawyer. And the Twitter files show that he was instrumental that day in ensuring that our story was throttled, that was censored. There was actual debate inside Twitter, but James Baker was sort of the final arbiter. And the other thing that we found out was that for weeks before the 2020 election, the FBI had been meeting with Twitter for these so-called election integrity meetings and warning them to look out for Russian disinformation, that was going to interfere with the election. And particularly, we know from Yoel Roth, who was then the chief censor of Twitter and I think has been unfairly maligned. But in a separate matter, he gave a sworn declaration in which he said that Twitter had told them to look out for a hack and leak operation, likely in October, likely involving Hunter Biden. This was before our story was published. They were effectively pre-bunking a story that they somehow knew was going to happen. My theory about how they knew it was going to happen and that the New York Post would have this story is that at that point, the FBI had a covert surveillance warrant on Rudy Giuliani. And although Rudy does not do a lot of texting or emailing, there is enough. There was certainly, if the FBI had been watching, which I'm sure they were, they would have seen the email in August of 2020 coming in from John Paul MacIsaac, the laptop repair shop owner where Hunter had abandoned his laptop. And John Paul MacIsaac had listed in this very forensic and detailed email the crimes that he thought he could perceive on the laptop, and that included a lot of money coming in from Russia, but mostly Ukraine and China. And then there were some texts between me and Rudy, just me saying, look, Rudy, please don't give it to the Daily Mail, we're going to run with it. So if the FBI, they certainly had the warrant, so I assume they were doing their job. They knew to pre-bunk our story. And that is exactly what they did. And when, the case Missouri versus Biden, became Missouri versus Murphy, the judge, Judge Doughty, he found that the government had coerced the social media companies into censoring us. It's just a textbook case of the First Amendment being flouted. And I know that there was some difference up in the Supreme Court, and I hope that case is still going.
Hang on, but this, I was part of the team. Rudy called me up, and they did watch, because they were looking at my emails too, and text. I was on the CCP part, and you could find out immediately, given my expertise, in 2 days that this thing was totally legit. Now, as a news story, I think you come for the corruption and you stay for the porn, right? But the heroism of this individual, of Miranda Devine, and the New York Post, and when I said about the scale against you, you have Rupert Murdoch. You have how serious those people are and how they know about defamation and all that, and their team. You have the New York Post, one of the most revered papers in the country, going back to Alexander Hamilton. You have Miranda Devine, I would argue, among the top 2 or 3 investigative reporters in the country. This story was bulletproof. They went through so many times and so much and wanted so much information. It was incredible. And when it came out, you saw the apparatus that can come after you to destroy the New York Post, right? To destroy it, and to destroy Miranda Devine and her team personally. These people are vicious, and you saw it right there. And everything that was said was correct. And I strongly believe if the information had gotten out there in that time, because Biden lied to the nation, bald-faced lied, the 2020 election, even beyond them trying to stealing it, we would have been victorious, right? Even overcome it, the power of that story. But it shows you what you're up against when you have to go, when they come after Murdoch, the Post, Miranda Devine, and everybody to destroy them.
I couldn't agree more, Stephen. And to that point, it's very disappointing to see the Financial Times on your lap.
Know thy enemy.
And I do want to get to Miranda speaking a little bit about the 51 intelligence officials, too. But before I do that, I would like to note Julie Kelly. There is no bigger advocate of the individuals implicated on January 6th than Julie Kelly. And not only is no one as big of an advocate of them, but no one is as effective as she is. And so it was very funny when I first met her and said, just so you know, I used to be a prosecutor in D.C. But we've become close ever since, thankfully, because I never worked on those cases in large part. But I would like to ask Julie kind of the same question about Miranda, but for you specifically on not just the January 6 cases, but your coverage, especially on the alleged pipe bomber, and kind of what went into your ability to still to this day report on these issues and kind of get it to the public's attention.
So I think we're still waiting for information on the pipe bomber, but as Darren Beatty would say, and I have to give him credit as well, as soon as that is exposed, whoever the individual is or was, what happened there in terms of the investigation being very active early on and then apparently shut down very quickly in February of 2021. But, you know, using the platform X, especially after it was purchased by Elon Musk, and having his interest in the pipe bomb story and other things related to January 6th, I think just sort of legitimized it, that it wasn't a conspiracy theory, that there was something really, really off about the pipe bomb story, because as Darren has said, that unravels all of January 6th unravels.
Well, and I'll just jump in. It's funny you mentioned conspiracy theories, because as Secretary Kennedy said recently, bless you, in his hearing, you call them all conspiracy theories, but they all ended up being true.
Yes.
But if you could go to, Julie, I know you've spoken about this quite a bit with the January 6 defendants, the role that social media companies played in working in tandem with law enforcement agencies to target these families and attack them, and even to some of the Catholic families as well.
So I think shutting down, first of all, Amazon Web Services deplatforming Parler on January 6th, or I believe it was the 7th or 8th, that was really, and then in tandem with Facebook, YouTube, and certainly Twitter. I think Twitter pulled 70,000 accounts that they said were spreading election disinformation, and they were responsible for instigating the insurrection. But what really was happening is they wanted to shut down Parler and shut down those accounts from providing different videos and accounts of what had happened on January 6th, especially related to excessive force by police, which was responsible for instigating a lot of those confrontations between protesters and police. So it was key in the regime and the media taking immediate control of the January 6th narrative. They would not tolerate anything contradictory to Trump supporters, incited by the president, attacked police, overran the Capitol, and tried to, overturn the results of the 2020 election. So getting rid of Parler, which a lot of people had flocked to because of Twitter's censorship already, and then deplatforming, of course, the president and then 70,000 other accounts, was very successful in taking control of that narrative and storyline early on. And then what Big Tech did, to your point, working hand in glove, and I know Stanley Woodward knows this even better than I do because he represented J6ers, is to produce records and data, messages, accounts that had been deleted and that Facebook had deleted, to show direct messages, group texts talking about going to the Capitol, using those messages and posts and memes as evidence against J6ers. I will tell you, one of the first sentencing hearings that I covered was a man from Maryland, and he pleaded guilty to the petty offense of parading in the Capitol. DOJ, Biden's DOJ, the DC U.S. Attorney's Office, who you shamefully used to work at. No, just kidding.
I only did homicide and carjacking.
You did the small crimes, not the insurrection crimes. So in seeking 6 months in prison for this man whose life had already been completely destroyed, they actually used retrieved memes that he had posted on Facebook to try to demonstrate and show the judge how he had been brainwashed into believing the big lie, that he was a threat to his community, that he needed to be rehabilitated in prison. And again, social media, big tech working probably without any sort of search warrant or any formal process, just to hand over all of the files of their clients and their customers.
Thank you, Julie. Let me get to Mike Davis for a second on kind of these core antitrust issues. There are a lot of arguments out there these days on, big tech companies advance them, other companies advance them when they, deal with the Justice Department, that basically American companies must monopolize in order to compete abroad. Why is that a terrible idea, and can you kind of expound more on your thoughts about that?
Yeah, Google makes this argument quite regularly. I think Rachel Bovard, who's here, has batted this down. Will Chamberlain, who is here, has batted this down. Remember what Google said. We had a drone program with America. Gail Slater knows very well about this issue. We have a drone program between Google and America, or we did. It was called Project Maven. And the woke employees of Google did not like the fact that Google was running this drone program for America. So they cut, it's a monopolist running this program. So they cut off this American drone program and left the American military and intelligence agencies holding the bag. There was no one else to turn to because, again, Google's a monopolist, right? At the same time that Google cut off this Project Maven drone program, they were secretly working with the CCP on Project Dragonfly to spy. It was a spy program. They were using Dragonfly to spy, use the internet searches to basically to spy on the world, including all their citizens in China, including Americans. And so when Google comes in and says that they are Americana as apple pie, you just need to point out Project Maven and Project Dragonfly.
And Steve, in turning to kind of the need to focus on antitrust enforcement, how do you think that fits in with the president's overall economic agenda and what we've seen kind of on tariffs and other parts of his policies abroad?
If you look at tariffs and you look at like the work that Lena Khan has done about small business, I mean, we're a nation of entrepreneurs. We've got to get back to that. And part of the Trump America First, America Citizens First is based upon entrepreneurship. These 5 or 6 companies, and remember, this Faustian bargain was made by Democrats. You had both the bailout in 2008, the financial crisis, and then the Faustian bargain made with those 5 or 6 companies that, since we were a global hegemon militarily and with the post-war international rules-based order, they had to take the commanding heights in technology. And let's be brutally frank, they've blown it on social media. Say what you want, and I'm not an advocate of TikTok, but they're much more advanced in social media technologically than Silicon Valley, the apartheid state of Silicon Valley. And also now, because of DeepSeek, whether it's a Chinese psyop or not, you clearly see a way of artificial intelligence and not the brute force way we've done it. So what do these oligarchs want to have? They want to have a bailout immediately. They're asking for $500 billion. They're asking for all the weapons labs, the national labs, to be turned over to them. They're asking for more help on the data center energy side. And they want a bailout like either the Mercury program or the Marshall program, and they wrap it in red, white, and blue. These individuals they had their Damascene moment at 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the 5th of November, when Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania fell, and President Trump had returned in the greatest turnaround and comeback in history. That's all of a sudden they got old-time religion. These are horrible individuals. Their companies have done nothing but try to destroy American citizens. Business, and look at that, they've promoted businesses and destroyed, how many businesses has not simply Facebook, but Amazon destroyed of entrepreneurship. They have to be assaulted. They're powerful in this town, and this is what I'm so proud of the people who have come to work at the Justice Department, the FTC, the FCC, because these people have unlimited money. They've hired all the top law firms. They've hired all the lobbyists. I mean, this is David and Goliath, but the American people have our back on this. And this is one of the great fights. And I think it's got to become more upfront, Benny, in talking about these issues so that the actual base starts to understand that, hey, there's something very deep here. And this is, as much as tariffs are, and bringing back manufacturing jobs, this is central to my freedom as an American citizen and restoring this republic to be a constitutional republic.
Thank you, Steve. And while you noted Lena Khan, I think Gail and I and everyone in this room would agree we prefer the leadership of Chairman Ferguson. But let me turn to Benny Johnson for a second, and this is a question for all the panelists. But what you've seen now since, conveniently, November 2024 is a lot of companies embracing the MAGA side of them that they've never, really seen before. And I'd like to know why you think the MAGA base would be right to reject this new cloak that a lot of these companies kind of have draped around themselves, that they support the agenda.
So they're going in MAGA drag?
Yeah,
is that what you're saying? Okay, got it. It's the MAGA drag show. Look.
They're loud and
we
they're proud.
We love Americans.
Right.
We love
exactly.
memes.
Exactly.
We love freedom of speech.
Right.
Yeah.
How are you doing, fellow youths?
Yes, that's right. How do you do with the skateboard? That's right. Google with the skateboard. Steve Buscemi.
Yeah.
Hey, kids.
Why is it important?
Well, and why should the MAGA base reject this?
Right. So, Americans have always rejected censorship. One of the first edicts of King George, when he started to crack down on the original colonies, was to ban political cartoons of himself. It's one of my favorite parts of American history. He banned memes. Back in the day, half of the founders were either publishers or had parts in newspapers, or part owners of newspapers, small publications that had pamphlets. And for fun, the old school meme was a cartoon of King George, right? Getting his ass kicked or something like that, right? Like hanging from a tree or getting paddled, whatever. Tarred and feathered. Should bring that back, right, Steve? The point is that this is woven into the fabric of who we are. We like ridiculing the powerful. We actually enjoy that. That's how we keep them on our level. Ridiculing King George over here was saying, you're no more a king than I am. And we're both men. That's what a political cartoon was. That's what freedom of speech was. And the way that those were disseminated was not one massive oligarchical paper called the U.S. Constitutional America publication. It was a bunch of teeny little publications. You could call them accounts. You could call them like little shows, right? Or podcasts back in the day. It's the same mechanism upon which we have independent thought and communications today. It's the exact same. It's just technology has advanced it. And so to cut it off today is as evil as it was during the time of King George. You ask a young person, where do you get your news? I do this all the time. Go to a college campus, like touch grass, and go out and talk to kids. And realize that there is a miniature baby boom in the millennials and Gen Z. It's a very large population of Americans by number. And that you won't get MSNBC or CNN ever when you ask that question. Even if you're asking a leftist on a leftist campus, even if you're UC Boulder, you won't get like MSNBC. They still have their own independent creators that they follow. They still have their own left-wing podcasts that they follow. But an enormous number of young people, and we've seen the numbers of what's happening with young people, are swinging rightward, swinging towards, I don't even think it's the Republican Party, swinging towards a pro-freedom mindset because of independent creators on YouTube and on TikTok and on X and so on and so forth. It's actually very cool for a young person to be a rebel. And there's nothing more punk rock than voting for Trump with a MAGA hat on, right? Like that is the official FU. That is the greatest FU to the system that has ever existed. And so what do they do to counter that? Well, you know, we all know that like they create like miniature Harry Sissons in a lab. They turn out to be gooners and real lecherous, funny individuals themselves. They're funny content. They can't create their own authentic. It's all artificial. They can't create from the grass up their own actual authentic audiences on these platforms. They're totally screwed. And so what we learned over the last couple of weeks is that they have been using taxpayer dollars through USAID to actually fund left-wing corporate journalism against us. So imagine what it's like to be an entrepreneur. We talk about entrepreneurship, we talk about the tariffs. Imagine being a young entrepreneur and you want to start a media company. You want to start like a little company. I'm very proud of our 20 employees we have at Benny Media, right? They're all young. They're all like young, striving entrepreneurs. Imagine going to work, getting these very thin margins, as the chairman's talked about. They reduce the margins as much as they possibly can to make sure you can't earn, or they take your content down to zero, if not absolutely ban you. And then you wake up one day to see that like Politico has tens of millions of dollars of recurring revenue from the federal government through federal government contracts, aids, and subscriptions. You're like, this entire game is completely rigged against me. And oh, by the way, my taxpayer, half of my profit for my business is going to pay for those subscriptions for my competition. There is not, prima facie, there's nothing less competitive than that. That is the destruction of actually the fabric of how media, memes, comedy, the parodying of our leaders, the core, the fabric of like what media actually is in this country, and something that Americans love to do, which is to have a good old-fashioned time taking the piss out of our leaders. Like that is trying to destroy that, right, and centralize everything into an oligarchy. The social media companies are completely complicit in it, and it's why I'm like singing hallelujah listening to the chairman actually talk about it with authority and with insight for the first time ever. It's such a wonderful thing to hear.
And kind of same question to you, Miranda, and to you, Julie, as well, because you all saw directly the effect that these big tech companies can have on censorship, and now you're seeing a completely different version of them. And I'm sure it's interesting to you, having dealt with that pre-2024 and now the different behavior since President Trump was reelected. So kind of what's your take on that, and why should we be wary of this new change in behavior, to the extent one exists?
Well, look, Mark Zuckerberg, of course, was the guy who poured $400 million into getting out the vote in Democratic areas. Facebook was front and center on the censorship of the New York Post, you know, the oldest newspaper in the country and the second largest at that point by circulation. In fact, it was a Facebook guy who came onto Twitter to announce that Facebook had throttled the post before Twitter had even, put their pants on. So I think for all Zuckerberg's sucking up to Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago and his newfound, cool outfits and various sort of gold chain, and I think he does jiu-jitsu or something. Don't buy it. He's the same worm that he was for the Democrats, and he will turn again. And I just wanted to point out something that you mentioned about the 51 former Intel officials. This again is the government coming in to censor the New York Post. And, they knew full well, as the FBI did, that they'd had possession of the laptop for 10 months. Their forensic analysts had ascertained that it belonged to Hunter Biden, that it had not been tampered with in any way, and it was fit to use in a court of law, which it later was used. And so what we had was, this was not just 51 former intelligence officials who wrote this dishonest letter saying that the laptop was Russian disinformation, therefore our story. They actually called it, had all the earmarks of a Russian information operation, was their weasel words.
Disinformation.
No, they said information. Yeah. So, but it was of course, Politico and which they gave it to in the Washington Post, and everyone else said it was Russian disinformation, which was the message they wanted us to hear. It's only after the fact that they point out their weasel words. But anyway, those 51, most of them were CIA, including 5 former directors or acting directors of the CIA, people like John Brennan, Leon Panetta. But it wasn't just these formers. That letter had to go to a sort of classification review board inside the CIA. And Mike Morrell, who was the former acting director who was orchestrating all this, he had got a call from Antony Blinken, who was then a senior advisor to Joe Biden's campaign, then of course became the benighted Secretary of State. And he had basically told Morrell to get this action going because they needed a talking point for Joe Biden a couple of days later when he met Donald Trump in the final debate, a campaign debate. And this was a sort of get-out-of-jail-free card for Joe Biden. And so that letter went to the Classification Review Board. Mike Morrell put a sort of a rush job on it. And they realised that this was this was above their pay grade. So they sent it upstairs to Gina Haspel, who was then the CIA director under Donald Trump, and she gave it the green light. We know this because her COO, Andrew McCreadis, testified behind closed doors to Congress and said that he walked that letter across the corridor to Gina Haspel's office, and she gave it the green light. So this was really a CIA operation. It wasn't just a bunch of former intelligence officials. And as soon as that letter came out, Joe Biden did get out of jail. The whole story, Donald Trump tried to bring it up at the debate. The story was killed because Joe Biden just pointed to it. He said, the intelligence community says, this is garbage, this is a Russian plant, this is your mate, Rudy Giuliani, who has no credibility. And the story was absolutely killed, stone dead.
Julie, would you like to say something? Are you good?
Sure. Do you want me to say something?
Sure.
Okay.
I have one. I know I'm getting a lot of shaking about how we have to go. I wanted to give you a chance to chime in on this, and then I have one point that I want to ask Mike and Steve about.
I mean, real quickly, if there were J6ers here, they would say absolutely don't forget what big tech did to them to help destroy their lives. Not only producing all of their records and information, but also allowing the FBI to use informants and undercovers to infiltrate certain chats. I mean, we definitely saw that in the Whitmer Fednapping hoax. And so that's another behind the scenes thing that we can address at some point. So I'm sure if they were sitting here, anybody who has been victimized by big tech and these operations, January 6th, Whitmer, whatever the FBI entrapment of the day was, they definitely would want to see the administration, Gail and everyone else, and you push forward.
Thank you for that. And I want to leave it on a final kind of point and question, because when you get the shaking of the head and hands that the time is up, you have time for one more question. So I'll start with a little anecdote and end with a question, which is, so in 2017, I was working, some people may not know this, or may know this, I should say. In 2017, I was working in the White House counsel's office representing the president's office in the Mueller investigation. And I remember at that time, there were multiple moments in which our little team, led by Emmett Flood, thought we'd be able to get an outside law firm to help with the representation of the president. The outside law firm would represent him on the personal side, and we'd continue representing the office of the president. So multiple times on a Friday, we'd hear, big law firm X has agreed to represent the president. And then we'd show up Monday, hoping we'd have the apparatus of this big new law firm, and we were told, well, actually, no, they had to withdraw. They're not going to represent him. This is the sitting president of the United States who was falsely accused of colluding with Russia. And there was never any evidence of it. And anyway, it hampered him in negotiations with foreign leaders. It hampered him in all sorts of ways. And this happened probably 9 or 10 times, the same version of that. And obviously, Bill Clinton, when he was rightly accused of impropriety, he was able to have 2 huge law firms represent him. At the same time, they were competing to see who was really going to represent him. So now, having gone through all that, you then see companies that deplatformed President Trump's supporters being represented by the same law firms that proudly represent Guantanamo terrorists, but won't represent the sitting president of the United States, coming to the DOJ and saying, we're not faithfully carrying out President Trump's agenda by giving them whatever they want. So with that said, Mike Davis and Steve Bannon, what do you think about that?
What a question. I mean, this is the problem with cancel culture, that the left controls all of these key institutions. They control the media, they control academia, they control the military now. They control the bureaucracy, they control law firms, they control big tech. That's the problem. And what they're bullies, and I think that what you have to show bullies is strength, right? You can't cow to these bullies, and we cowed to bullies for too long. Let me just make an example on big tech. Do you think that Google and YouTube would be censoring conservatives if they competed against each other? No. They want consumers. If they competed against each other, they would not be abusing us by censoring us. Same thing with Facebook and Instagram. If they competed against each other, would they be abusing us with censorship? No, right? And that's the issue with big tech, with these big law firms. I love what President Trump is doing. He's sending a message to these big law firms that you're not welcome to do business with the federal government anymore. And so if they want to challenge that, that's great. I would say to their clients that maybe you should look at other law firms, because it's possible you may not get a good result if you're going with a law firm that's so anti-Trump. I mean, I just want to put that thought in your head.
Steve?
The big steal in 20 is going to turn out to be as providential as our victory in 16 and our victory in 24, because we had to see the depths to what this apparatus would do. Donald Trump, who had basically sacrificed everything to run for the presidency, and then what they did and the people around him, we were debanked, we were deplatformed. Credit cards are cut off. Banks I've been in business with 40 years, same with Trump. Credit cards I'd had for 40 years, canceled immediately. Law firms, white shoe law firms I had paid for years, including millions of dollars of my own money during the Mueller investigation, where I had a proctology exam for 60 hours between Mueller, House Intel, and Senate Intel, right? To get nothing but a perjury trap. And President Trump, the same exact thing, people around President Trump. And if it was not for heroes that are in this building today, in those years of 21 and 22 and 23 that stepped up to represent him and really to represent the American people, we wouldn't be here. That's why this building and the people in it, and the FTC and the FCC and all of it, history is watching us. The next couple of years is going to determine the direction of this republic, and don't think we've won it. We're a long way from winning. These people have money, they have power, they're absolutely vicious, and they're not going to just turn the keys over to the greatest empire that's ever been built. And that's what's before us. But we saw in the dark days of 21 and 22 and 23 what they're prepared to do. And everybody should remember that lesson every day and remember the heroes in this building today that would not fold. If we have that same toughness and resilience and anti-fragile, we're going to win this.
Well, thank you for that.
Can I just add, I just want to add one last thing about Andrew Ferguson. When I have a photo with Andrew, we get traction and eyeballs. When I have it with Lena, it's viral, baby. Okay? You got to know, that's the business we're in.
Well, that's the algorithm. That's not a reflection on Andrew. That's a... So, we'll figure that out eventually. We'll figure that out eventually. But I do want to thank these panelists, number one, for being here and taking time out. They couldn't have been more excited to be here, and it's a blessing to call you all friends. But I want to thank everyone in the room as well. All of your support means the world to us when we're in this building and fighting these battles. So just really grateful for all that you do. And we look forward to another occasion to have you all at the Department of Justice, whose doors are open for you. So anyway, thank you all. We really appreciate it.
All right. So you just heard, am I on? Can you hear me? Yeah. You just heard compelling stories expressing examples and concerns related to censorship. We're going to spend the next panel talking about responses to censorship, and are there potential responses that are available. There have been some hints about that in the opening remarks and in some of the comments that Mike and others have made, but we're going to spend the rest of this time talking about potential responses to censorship. And we're going to put aside the potential arguments about state action. There's been some suggestions that these companies are working in concert with the government, such that you could try to make a state action argument. We're not going to address the state action components and the potential First Amendment, formal First Amendment arguments. We're going to look at other possible arguments one can make regarding responses to censorship and big tech censorship. My name is Roger Alford. I have been a law professor since 2012 at Notre Dame Law School, the one great law school that is very, very friendly to conservatives. Thank you. And also went to the national championship game. They lost, but and then I worked with Macon Delrahim in the first Trump administration as a deputy, and then I'm so pleased and honored to be working with Gail Slater. What an amazing woman, as her principal deputy number 2. So we're just thrilled to be here. I also want to preface by saying there's a lot of litigation right now against big tech related to antitrust or other matters. None of those cases that were brought in the first Trump administration or the Biden administration relate to censorship. They're all about other aspects of conduct. And so, you know, obviously we're sensitive to that litigation. We're not talking about issues related to their current conduct that is being subject to litigation right now. We're just talking about, are there potential laws and responses to concerns about censorship? Okay, and so we're going to talk about antitrust, potential consumer protection, potential state laws that Adam is very familiar with, and maybe there's others, and then maybe defenses under Section 230. Tom DiMatteo, I think, is known to almost all of us in the room, senior counsel at Chief Counsel to Senator Mike Lee in Senate Judiciary Committee. What a great spot to be in the administration right now, working for Mike Lee on the Senate Judiciary Committee. He has worked in the Justice Department under Macon Delrahim and then he had a small stint in private practice before he went to work with Senator Mike Lee. And then we have Alita Kass, formerly of the Federalist Society, who currently is senior counsel at OLP with my friend Aaron Reitz. And she has been incredibly instrumental in looking at free speech issues during her work at the Federalist Society. And then Adam Kandub, who is a general counsel at the Federal Communications Commission, a good friend from Michigan State, who worked extremely hard in the Net Choice v. Paxton case and knows the Texas and Florida laws as well as I think anybody. And so we're going to talk about all of those different arguments. So antitrust laws, consumer protection, maybe other state laws that might be available, and what responses we might have. So Tom, and this is going to be fairly free-flowing and colloquial. We're not going to have like formal programs. So Tom, do you want to start with your thoughts on that? And also, if you want to mention potential new laws you're thinking about.
Sure. Thanks very much, Roger. And Gail, thank you so much for your leadership and putting this together. It's really a timely and very important topic, and I'm glad you're shedding light on it. Obviously shows how President Trump was wise in choosing you and Chairman Ferguson for his role. So, you know, antitrust really comes down to looking at market power, right? That's the fundamental piece of antitrust and looking at monopoly power. And we've heard so much on the first panel about the power that these big tech companies have. And it really strikes me as sitting there and listening to it. Facebook, when they take down the Hunter Biden laptop story, 80% of the following of that story dies down. 80%, that's market power, right? So, you know, the antitrust side of things of looking at the largeness of these tech companies, and it really comes down to censorship because they have the ability to exclude. They have the ability because there's no competitive alternative. So they are the gatekeeper, right? So when Truth Social was released, Truth Social was put up on Apple. Well, guess what? On the App Store. But it was not put up on the Google Play Store for over 9 months. Well, we only have 2 operating systems for phones in this country. That's a duopoly. And if one of them is choosing not to do it, 50% of people aren't being able to access it. Again, that's showing monopoly power. So that's ways that these gatekeepers can censor and can affect the discourse in this country is because they have the power to do it in the marketplace. And, you know, Roger, on the one for earlier panels too, we talked about Chairman Ferguson mentioned the power of advertising, because that's where these big tech companies are getting their money. Advertising is driving, you get the eyeballs, you get the ads, you get the dollars. That's exactly how it works. So in the Senate, Senator Lee introduced last Congress and reintroduced in this Congress, the America Act, which gets at the heart of the ad tech stack, and it breaks up the vertical integration of Google and other large tech companies owning both the avenue in which ads are sold and the buying and the selling side of the tools. You break up that ad tech stack, the dollars are spread out across other companies, and it's a more competitive marketplace. And the ability to censor or the ability to exert your market power becomes less acute, and there's actually competition in the marketplace.
Alida, you have a perch where you looked at this broadly at the Federalist Society and now with Aaron at OLP. Do you want to just talk about your thoughts on the different legal angles that might be pursued to address these concerns?
Sure. Thank you so much. And I do want to thank Gail and for putting this together. And Aaron, I'm so excited to get started working on these questions. And yeah, I feel like having spent a good amount of time sort of observing and like in the way that I've heard Chairman Ferguson talk, like sort of having this extended period of time where I was just this sort of question running through my head of like, what is happening? Just sort of private actors behaving in ways that are not readily explainable by the sort of the framework of incentives that we've been just sort of taught to sort of understand how the world works. And thinking, I still believe that everyone responds to incentives. I just think that we've been slow to update a complete framework for the incentives and sort of how they operate. I think in the same way that sort of sometimes you have a sense that the consumer welfare standard is limited to just the sort of the incremental dollar, and there's more to life than that. And so watching this, and I think we encounter this a lot on the right, that there's such a reluctance to see private actors as the agents of censorship and coercion, right? And the sort of the safe place is to see it downstream from some form of government power. And so I guess sort of my first thought on that is we can look at sort of, even if true, why is the government able to exercise that amount of control over the public discourse, right? And it is, in fact, because of the concentration and scale of the big tech companies. Like, they wouldn't be trying to do it, you know, if it were like a truly competitive market. And the absence of that sort of effective competition is another it sort of reinforces that dynamic, takes away any real incentive to fight the government on this. And I guess the last thing I would say is, like, that's Murthy, right? And so whatever you think about the dissent from Justice Alito in that case, like, it is striking that we could not persuade a majority on the court that the tech companies would not have done more or less the same thing with or without the government coercion. So I guess sort of to wrap up on your question, I think sort of it seems like, you know, if we see this as a problem of government power, right, and government pressure, then we will not have really resolved anything one way or another. I mean, there was a great EO back in the Trump 1 administration. Didn't really move the needle, right? And you're just kind of leaving a loaded gun in the middle of a park for somebody like the next person to come along and pick up that power and leverage it. And so it starts, I think, with an appreciation that the power is the problem, and so then you're looking at what are the tools that, or sort of what are the problems with the existing framework that have facilitated that kind of coercive power. And I guess I would say there it's like a sort of the sort of the longstanding misinterpretation of Section 230 that that's essential to the kind of operation that the big tech platforms do at scale. Like, that is the mechanism by which they are able to kind of have all of the power and none of the accountability. And then second is just kind of abdication of meaningful antitrust limits. And I'm not going to do a better job than Andrew did on the first panel in describing, like, how we have sort of missed the mark in understanding what is and is not an antitrust problem.
Right. Adam, you have written and thought and consulted a tremendous amount on issues related to censorship. Your previous stint at the FCC, you're consulting with the state of Texas in Net Choice v. Paxton, and then now you're general counsel at the FCC with Brendan Carr, Chairman Carr. Do you want to just talk about your thoughts on some of those, putting aside the antitrust laws for the moment, or consumer protection? Do you want to talk about some of those laws and what might be available there?
Yeah, but I might weave back into antitrust, if that's okay, for permission. You know, listening to the last panel really brought us all back to the bad days of 2021, and they were really bad. And thinking about the Hunter Biden laptop fiasco, censorship, what was truly one of the many things that was truly horrible about it was that people couldn't text each other the link to the story. And it hit me, something deep. Something has changed in the way Americans communicate. And of course, as someone who spent a lot of time studying history of telecommunications law, for the last 200 years, private communications, either on government platforms like the post office or private platforms like the telephone company or the telegraph company, were open to all, regardless of the content of the message. And that is partly an antitrust regulation, partly just a regulatory industry, partly common carriage obligation that has, of course, died out in the 1990s due to deregulation at the FCC. But it really is essential to democracy. We cannot communicate, we can't have a democratic discourse if we're not free to text each other links to really important stories. Now, that legal requirement, whether it comes through the Communications Act, whether it comes through an antitrust settlement, whether it comes through a creative and innovative approach to Section 230, I'm fine with. I'm agnostic. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. But that's I think the essential right, that as I think the Trumpist communications regulation, and I think exactly the sort of direction that Chairman Carr is going, we have to center on. It has to be focused on the user. It has to be based upon traditional rights that we have to communicate in democracy. I don't care how you get there, whether it's antitrust, whether it's Section 230, whether it is the Texas social media law, which, you know, I have the greatest respect for Chairman Ferguson, but I believe will rise again. We can have that conversation. Looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, so let's drill down a little bit on some of these laws. Let's start with antitrust laws. Section 1 and Section 2 are the two big alternatives: monopoly power, and then the abuse of that monopoly power that has anti-competitive effects. The monopoly power requires a certain market power percentages. You need a certain threshold of percentages. But the critical point here is we need to make an argument of consumer harm, right, and anti-competitive consumer effects. Everyone recognizes that consumer welfare includes not just price, but also, and not just output, but also quality harms and innovation harms. And so we all know the possibility that there can be quality harms and anti-competitive effects someday. But let's talk, putting aside collusion right now, just monopoly abuse. Can we talk about that? And anyone want to take up the story about how one might frame an argument of monopoly abuse through actions such as quality harm regarding censorship? Does anyone want to take a stab at that?
Sure. So, Roger, I appreciate everyone in this room is probably on the same page with your definition of the consumer welfare standard, and I think we all think about it the same. But I think there are some people who don't think that quality is actually a part of it, and I think that's part of the goal of this and the goal of the ongoing discussion on antitrust is to start opening people's mind to that quality harm, that innovation harm that we are experiencing. And often it's the libertarians who don't think it's part of the consumer welfare discussion. Which is interesting because libertarians are often very skeptical of large government power and censorship by the government. Well, the perfect analogy here is also monopolies can censor. Monopolies have that power, and in some instances, monopolies have more power than the government. So you have to think about it through that lens when you come at the monopoly power angle. And then the harm, as you point out, is the reduction in not only, well, I think it's very clear to us that the focus has been on suppressing conservative voices and bias against conservatives because these large tech companies are by and large focusing on that because of their political views. But even folks on the left should recognize that no one wants public discourse to be tamped down. That is bad for democracy. It hurts the quality of getting to the right answer. And that's a true consumer harm, and it certainly reduces innovation because there's fewer thoughts in the marketplace. And we heard, on the panel before this about these stories that were, viewed as conspiracy theories and then ultimately turned out to be true. Well, when they're suppressed, how can we actually get to the truth if they're not actually allowed to be put in the public discourse?
Yeah, the other thing I would add on quality harms is we already have case law about monopoly abuse challenges related to quality. It's not about censorship, but there's other types of quality issues that have been litigated related to Facebook, not the FTC case, but there's private litigation arguing that there's been privacy degradation in the experience at Facebook. There's a case in California making the argument of a privacy degradation case, which is a quality harm. Essentially, the failure to innovate, which is often alleged with respect to monopolies, is essentially a statement that they're not as creative, as cutting edge, as quality oriented as they should be if they didn't have the monopoly moat. And so the innovation harms essentially are a version of quality harms, I think, would be another argument that one can make. So I do think, also, I think a really wonderful example that is not very well known in Europe is, the possibility of delaying technologies, that green technologies as a potential type of quality harm, I think is another example of that. So there's a whole variety of different arguments about quality harm. Unless anyone else wants to add on monopoly statements, I'll move to collusion. Anyone else?
I'll add, as an outsider to most antitrust discussions, what is the utility that most social media companies provide? And that's a question that's outside of most of the antitrust discussion, but I think it's true. The really very serious work, I guess it's Allard in the American Economic Review, showing that for most people, social media use makes them more unhappy. At least, the best hedonic measures we have. So now that's sort of perverse. Then we should want more monopoly, so we have less of it. But the point is, should we care at all if we don't have any of it? And from an economic perspective, because what is the great benefit to the economy? Well, presumably, reducing information costs by providing advertisements more cheaply and effectively. But of course, that's never really even proven either. And they always sort of, bring out the experts to crank up the models to say, oh, look at this is what Facebook has done for our society. And I think a more critical eye to both of these claims, I think, could, recast a lot of these debates, given the fact that it is somewhat unusual. It's a free service. It's not quite, the normal thing that economists and industrial organization is used to dealing with.
I do have a thought on that. That wasn't entirely where I thought you were going with that opening question of sort of what is the utility. Maybe the sort of the more glass half full angle is that many American citizens rely on sort of some version of big tech, to whether it's sort of search term kind of sort of trying to answer questions about what they sort of need to, and sort of the information that they need and want to live their lives in a fulfilling way, or remain engaged in the discussion and debate of ideas. Sort of take the ostensible value that we're getting from big tech, right? And if that process sort of at its highest form is undermined because you have these private gatekeepers that are interfering with your ability to put these big tech tools to their ostensible use, then I guess that's my rosier version of that.
Roger, one thing I'd like to follow up on. You mentioned that these social media products are free. They might be priced free, and people may perceive them to be free. But another way to look at it is, they're not free because you're giving up all your data in order to get this product. So you're actually, some people put their entire lives on Facebook. I don't have Facebook, but all their pictures since they were, kids, and their kids' pictures are on there, and all of that information and where they're going and where they're going on vacation. The amount of data that they collect, there's a massive value to that. So I'd kind of look at it in that lens, and that it's not free. It's you're giving up as a consumer a ton of information about yourself, and that kind of brings us back to the point about ads, and that's why advertising is so valuable.
So before we leave monopoly power, I want to tease out an idea that I've been thinking about a lot, because I have a very close friend who's on the Meta Oversight Board, which is this binding independent organization that reviews censorship concerns, and it's an independent part of Meta that issues decisions, and they have to make these censorship decisions within this special body called the Oversight Board at Facebook. And he raises often the issue that there's so many things that have to be reviewed that it's not really humans that are making the censorship decisions. It's very much algorithmic decisions. There's millions and millions of takedowns that happen on a weekly basis, on Meta. So can we pause for a moment? A lot of discussion about algorithmic collusion. It's a big thing in the antitrust space. But what about algorithmic censorship and the way you write the code so that certain things are tagged as a violation of the codes of service? And is there sufficient conduct with algorithmic censorship that you can go after the company for abuse of their power? Anyone want to take that issue?
Sure. So algorithms don't write themselves. They don't naturally create it. They're not naturally occurring. So what is put into an algorithm to get a result? It's human input. So when it's convenient for companies to say, oh, the algorithm did it, it's like offloading responsibility. But there was a human at some point that created this algorithm in order to get the result that it created. So I think it's important also, as outside observers, we don't have access to the code to see what was put in the algorithm. We don't have an email chain really between people to see how the code was built unless you take discovery. So it's a convenient argument for companies to make that the algorithm did it, but far too often we see that algorithm suppressing conservative voices and not the other way around. So you have to wonder what people are sticking into this algorithm. And then I think it's also important to think about, under the antitrust laws, collusion, because of the way algorithms are created and the way I just mentioned, the current antitrust laws actually do get at algorithmic collusion. And it's convenient for the companies to make that argument again, but there are human actors behind that, and that is actual action by a company, and that does go under our current state of affairs in antitrust law.
Let me just give you the analogy from the Google ad tech case, where you had to get to the source code to see the way that the source code was written to engage in the allegations of auction manipulation. And expert witnesses looked at the source code to show the type of auction manipulation that was happening, and then that's used in the expert analysis and in the case to show that there was an abuse of monopoly power in the ad tech market. Similarly, someone, as you say, has to operationalize the terms of service in the algorithmic coding. And so someone somewhere under Jack Dorsey's Twitter is telling the computer that misgendering is a violation of the terms of service, right? And then that code then takes down anything where there is any examples of misgendering. So I think that's an interesting example of how algorithms can do that at scale. We're talking about scale censorship through algorithms. Any other before we go to collusion?
Well, it's just interesting on the Texas case, social media case, where all of a sudden, sometimes the platforms will say, "Oh, it's just the algorithm who did it. We didn't do it." But when it came to the Texas social media case, and of course when that was being regulated, they flipped sides and they said, "Oh no, our algorithms are our protected First Amendment speech." So I mean, Coney Barrett's concurrence went on that point. I mean, that's something we have to decide, and I think it really is a normative question at some level. Are we going to say, look, do we have more efficient results if we say liability ends here, or if we say we have more efficient results as like you're responsible for everything that comes out?
Okay, let's go to collusion. Let's talk about arguments about collusion. The example that everyone knows that your boss talks about a lot is the Parler story, that basically on the same day or within a couple days, you had 3 or 4 major actors working in concert, one would suspect. There's not been a formal investigation. To take down Parler, to take down the president. You couldn't get it on the App Store, right? It was there, but then it was taken off for iPhones and for Androids. And then you couldn't have access on the cloud. Parler couldn't, they basically were deplatformed from the cloud as well. So I know Senator Lee likes to talk about this story a lot. Can we talk about that? Again, we don't have investigative evidence, but just the speculation is very much that there was some sort of collusive argument. Do you want to just talk about that story in case everyone's not aware of it?
Sure, yeah. So the Parler story is a good example, Roger, as you pointed out, of when you have consolidation and you have very few companies controlling the hosting of an app and the access for consumers to get the app, it's not difficult for them to, and again, you said there's no investigation, so but the market dynamic certainly set up where there's very few actors, coordination is a lot more likely, and it's certainly easier to occur, and they can say, well, we're going to take it down off AWS and we're not going to host it. We're going to take it off both the iOS, the Apple Play Store and the Google Play Store, and consumers aren't going to have access to it. And that censors anyone who is using that app. And it's easy to coordinate and agree to something when you have a limited, consolidated market with very few players.
Anyone to add to the Parler story? So let's talk about collusion among big tech companies through their trade associations. So one of the more interesting questions about collusion is, like, they get in a room together. I mean, Gail worked for an internet association that essentially was taken over by big tech. and they get in a room together and they all agree, like, let's agree on the common standard that we're all going to apply, right? And then they defend themselves. They ignore Pennington defenses. We're just lobbying the government. That's all we're doing. But before they go to the, legislature or to the administration, they all agree on a common standard on privacy or sex trafficking or, censorship or what's bad or what's good. Can we talk about collusion in trade associations on common standards and whether or not that might be an actionable offense with these kinds of censorship issues? Any thoughts on that?
I'll take it. So you do see often the largest players coming together, as you said, through these trade associations, and then often being open to regulation, and it's to the regulation that they'd agreed to. And I think you have to wonder, well, why do these companies want to be regulated? And it's because they're setting what the regulation is, and they're building another moat around themselves, insulating themselves from more competition. So it's a lot easier for a larger company to comply with regulations, specifically ones that they've coordinated through a trade association to set. And then it boxes out new entrants who are perhaps more innovative, but they don't have the capital to actually comply with these regulations. So it further insulates these incumbent large players by building up the wall through regulation.
Is all of that behavior protected under Norr Pennington?
I think that's something that should be looked at.
Right. Yeah, I think all of the ancillary stuff prior to going to the legislature where they agree on a common standard is the point of weakness I think that they might have, and that would be useful. Let's talk about Section 230. Both of you are experts on this issue. Extremely interesting issue. It's been debated for years and years now. Is it a sword? Is it a shield? Does it insulate them? Does it give them First Amendment rights? Let's talk about, for both of you, your thoughts about the role of Section 230 with respect to censorship.
Everyone's talking about what it was like in 2020, 2019, when I was in the first administration. One of the things I was most proud of was the NTIA petition on Section 230, which I think put forward a bunch of reforms. What is even more gratifying is I think a lot of courts have accepted a lot of those changes. So we're in a very different environment now than we are in 2019. Essentially, in 2019, the courts looked at Section 230C1, which is sort of the generic carrier liability protection for the content of third parties, and it was get out of jail free for everything. Whenever they kicked off our President Trump, they said that Section 230 protects us. Of course, Section 230 says nothing about removals, but nonetheless, and courts accepted this. That has begun to change. I think the Anderson v. TikTok out of the Third Circuit is a great change. I think the administration has to move. The FCC has power to do interpretive rules. I mean, my boss is not here, so I can't speak to this. But it could happen, perhaps, something like that. And that's something we're very interested in. I mean, it is a clear area where the courts have been lazy and sloppy. And it's a place for government to step up and say, look, this is what the law says, stick to it.
Yeah, I share your enthusiasm for the Anderson TikTok opinions, and excuse me, and I think there's just a few threads to this, right? Like I think the way that big tech exercises its power at scale requires this kind of sort of heads I win, tails you lose sort of interpretation of it, where they have all of the immunity of mere sort of passive posting of third-party content, right? But all of the power that then carries over to actually manipulating that content and sending it out and targeting, as with the Anderson TikTok case, right? Like targeting, sort of permitting the casual disregard of the 10-year-old girl, right? And you can't do that at scale without the sort of that sort of what has been, I think, a pretty deeply entrenched misinterpretation of 230. I also think that that going forward, there's this other thread, which is this confusion over like sort of what is it, like clown nose on, clown nose off, like it is our speech, it's not our speech, right? And just kind of sort of clarifying, and maybe even like, dare I dream, right? Some sort of deeper grounding and original understanding of the First Amendment in terms of like the scope and substance of what it protects. Like, does it protect the artificial speech of algorithms, right? And also, like, who does it protect? Like, who are the beneficiaries of that protection, right? Is it limited to the natural rights of flesh and blood natural humans, or is it, sort of any good American that resides in a drawer in Delaware, just like TikTok USA?
Because of Omid, we have run out of time. Omid went way too far into my time, but I don't regret it. I enjoyed every single minute of the first panel. So I think we are going to cut it short here because of scheduling commitments that we all have. And we will and have been and hope to continue the conversation among the different leaderships here. So thank you, Gail, for convening this roundtable, and thank you for all of you coming. It's been wonderful.